Chapter 1. The Garden Fate and the Whisper in China. The sun glinted brightly off the polished silver teapots and delicate porcelain cups arranged neatly on the trestle tables lining the vicarage lawn. It was the annual St. Mary Mead Summer Garden. Fate an event as immovable on the village calendar as Christmas Day or Lady Selborne's charity ball. Bunting fluttered lazily in the warm July breeze, and the scent of sweet peas and baking scones filled the air. Beneath the pleasantries and floral hats, however, something darker lay in wait, though. Of course, none suspected it just yet. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near the edge of the lawn, a gentle figure in a soft gray shawl and a straw hat decorated with a sprig of lavender. Her blue eyes, sharp beneath their kindly lids, scanned the bustling scene with benign interest. She had attended countless fetes like this one in her long years in St. Mary Mead, and she found them infinitely instructive. The way people behaved when they believed they were simply enjoying themselves told far more about their true character than any formal interview or confession ever could. It was nearing 3 o'clock, and the tea tent was gathering momentum. Mrs. Leslie Garraway, the new arrival from London who had recently taken up residence at the old Braxton house, was holding court among the villagers. With her chic-bobbed hair, brassy laugh, and unnervingly candid opinions, she was very much the subject of village interest, and not entirely the positive kind. "She's far too forward," whispered Mrs. Hartnell to Miss Marple, nodding disapprovingly toward Mrs. Garraway's crimson shoes. "Imagine showing up at a village fete in heels. Red ones." Miss Marple smiled politely. Perhaps she wished to make a statement. City people often feel quite at odds in the country unless they make themselves noticeable. "But really," Mrs. Hartnell went on, "the way she carries on, flirting shamelessly with poor Mr. Cartwright right in front of his wife, too." Miss Marple turned her gaze discreetly to the rector's son, young Mr. Cartwright, who was indeed standing rather too close to Mrs. Garraway as she stirred her tea with languid amusement. His wife, Susan, sat stiffly 2 seats away, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale beneath her parasol. Yes, Miss Marple thought, there was tension there. And not just in the expected ways. Suddenly, a scream cut through the murmur of conversation and the clink of china. Everyone turned. A young maid, Nina, one of the vicarage girls, was standing beside the refreshment table, her hand to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. "She's dead," Nina gasped. "She's not moving, Mrs. Garraway. She just fell forward like a sack." In the stunned silence that followed, several people sprang into motion. Dr. Godfrey Havers, who had been enjoying a cucumber sandwich beneath the rose arbor, hurried over and crouched beside the figure slumped awkwardly in her folding chair. Miss Marple, moving with deceptive speed, arrived just in time to see the doctor place 2 fingers at the base of Mrs. Garraway's slender neck, then frown and shake his head. "I'm afraid she's gone," he said grimly. The teacup still rested precariously in her limp hand, its contents half spilled across the crisp tablecloth. Her eyes were open and glassy, her body disturbingly still. No sign of struggle, no dramatic collapse, just a sudden silent departure from life in the middle of tea. A few gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Heart," someone whispered. Must have been her heart. Miss Marple looked at the cup, then at the woman's face. Her expression hadn't changed. It was as though she'd simply ceased to exist. But Miss Marple, who had seen death many times and not always natural, noticed something else. The faint discoloration at the corners of the woman's lips, the odd position of her fingers on the cup's delicate handle, and most curiously of all, the faint scent of bitter almonds, noticeable only for an instant before it was carried away by the wind. It was not a heart attack. She looked up quietly and caught the eye of Susan Cartwright, who was staring at the body with a strange, unreadable expression. Later, after the police had arrived and cordoned off the scene, Miss Marple sat once again in her chair at the edge of the lawn, sipping a cup of tea that she had brewed herself. In the vicarage kitchen, the fete had been officially ended. Villagers had been asked to remain for questioning, and Inspector Cray, a stolid man with a fondness for pipe tobacco and blunt conclusions, was beginning to assemble his theory. No. Sign of injury. Could be poisoning, he admitted reluctantly to Dr. Havers, though it seems odd at a public event. Too many eyes. Cyanide would do it, the doctor offered, glancing toward the body, now discreetly covered with a blanket. And it acts quickly. But how would she have taken it? And why? Inspector Cray looked over toward Miss Marple, who had been watching them both, entirely unobtrusively. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, walking over. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" "I am," she said gently. "You've helped us out before, I'm told. Anything you observed today? Anything unusual?" "Oh, everything was quite ordinary, Inspector. Except, of course, the murder." Cray blinked. "Murder, you say? Not suicide?" "I don't believe Mrs. Garraway was the sort of woman to bring her own poison to a garden fete, particularly not one where she was so visibly enjoying herself. And if I may say so, people who commit suicide tend to give off signs in absence of future plans, a certain resignation. But she was full of plans. She told me not 10 minutes earlier that she was going to redecorate the Braxton drawing room in what she called modernist chintz." Cray frowned. "And you think someone poisoned her teacup?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said. "Though of course we mustn't jump to conclusions. But I wonder, was it her own cup she was drinking from?" The inspector's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Well, there was rather a fuss just before tea was served. I believe the cups were being shuffled about. Nina, the vicarage maid, was handing them out, but someone bumped into her." "I'll speak to the girl," Cray said. "Thank you, Miss Marple." As he walked off, Miss Marple turned her attention once again to the tea tent. One teacup had whispered the truth, but only she had heard it. The question was, to whom had the cup been intended? And was Mrs. Garraway the intended victim at all? She suspected this fate would be remembered for more than its Victoria sponge this year. Chapter 2. Shadows Among the Roses from the Tea. Cup that whispered the truth. A Miss Marple mystery. The village of Little Compton had a way of pretending that nothing ever changed. Even when it did. By the morning, following the tea gathering at the vicarage, the entire village hummed with nervous energy, like bees disturbed from their hive. The death of Letitia Marsh, pronounced a heart attack by the attending doctor, though with a notable lack of finality, had stirred a sensation the village hadn't felt since Major Tansley had been discovered dead in his greenhouse 15 years prior, surrounded by his prized orchids and an overturned bottle of arsenic weed killer. The chatter started before breakfast. At Mrs. Barry's bakery, murmurs passed between warm loaves and scones. At the post office, eyes darted over. Spectacles, watching every passerby as if their gait or expression might betray a motive. By 10 o'clock, the village's rumor mill had fully engaged. Some claimed Letitia had been clutching her teacup in death. Others insisted she'd dropped it in horror. A few even muttered about poisons, a sinister leaf from the shelves of crime novels, half read and half remembered. Yet amidst the whirlwind of chatter, Miss Jane Marple remained the calm in the center of the storm. She had returned to her rose garden that morning, pruning a rambling shrub of Albertine climbing roses that had threatened to overthrow her trellis. But though her hands worked the shears with practiced care, her mind was deep in reflection. Letitia Marsh hadn't been a universally beloved figure. That much was becoming clear. While she was undeniably elegant and refined, there had always been something faintly theatrical about her, something that set her apart from the village's cozy familiarity. She had lived in Italy for decades before returning to Little Compton just 2 years earlier. That time abroad, Miss Marple had always thought, lingered in her like foreign perfume, noticeable and not always welcome. But more than that, Miss Marple recalled Letitia's expression just before her collapse. That peculiar tightening of the mouth, the startled, almost accusing glance at the tea tray, and the way her hand had trembled ever so slightly as she reached for her cup. These were not the marks of a simple cardiac arrest. Not to Jane Marple's eye. She was still pondering this when a light knock came at her front gate. Young Emily Davis stood there, red-cheeked and fidgeting. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said in a voice far too eager to be casual. "I was just passing and thought I'd see if you needed anything from the grocer's." Miss Marple smiled, gently brushing a few petals from her gloves. "That's very kind of you, Emily, but I've all I need. Unless, of course, you've news from the village you feel I simply must hear." The girl flushed and bit her lip. "Oh, not news, exactly. Only, well, everyone's talking about Mrs. Marsh." "Yes, I expect they are," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "They say it was a bad heart. But Daisy from the vicarage told Vera, who told Mr. Gibbons, that Dr. Hewitt looked rather puzzled when he left. Said he wasn't completely sure." "Did he now?" said Miss Marple, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. "Doctors, my dear, are very capable in their way, but even the best of them miss the subtle signs. Human nature, however, rarely lies." Emily blinked, uncertain how to respond. "Do you think it was something else then?" Miss Marple smiled again. "I think," she said softly, "that when a woman clutches her teacup with white knuckles and gasps just after sipping it, we ought to look not only at the heart, but at what the heart may have been reacting to." Emily's eyes widened, and Miss Marple chuckled lightly. "That's all speculation, of course. Run along now, dear, and tell Mrs. Larch I hope her cat is recovering from that unpleasant incident with the hedgehog." Once the girl had gone, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, settled into her armchair, and gazed out the lace-covered window toward the distant church steeple. The tea gathering had offered more than just idle conversation. It had revealed subtle gestures, hidden tensions, and perhaps a motive or two. Letitia had made a pointed comment about someone not being quite who they claimed to be, hadn't she? It had been said half in jest, but there'd been steel behind the words. And hadn't Geraldine Ponsonby flushed rather deeply at that moment? Miss Marple hadn't missed it. Nor had she missed the odd way Mr. Edwin Bleeth had stared at Letitia afterward coldly, as if weighing something unsaid. Later that day, the village was startled once again when Inspector Graves arrived from St. Mary Mead. He was a lean man, with thinning brown hair, known more for his procedural efficiency than intuitive flair. Yet, in a village like Little Compton, his very presence was enough to unsettle the dust. He began with a visit to the vicarage, asking Reverend Leach a series of polite but pointed questions about the tea gathering. Who had poured the tea? Who had passed the cups? Had anyone touched Mrs. Marsh's cup besides herself? The vicar, flustered and puffing, admitted that Geraldine had helped serve, but only after insisting, as she always does. "And who prepared the tray?" Graves asked, consulting a notebook. "The maid, Molly. She's worked for us since her aunt retired. Very dependable girl. I can't imagine, well, of course I'm not suggesting anything." Inspector Graves noted each answer with quiet thoroughness. But the presence of a dead woman, a half-finished cup of tea, and an entire gathering of potential witnesses meant one thing. No conclusion would be reached quickly. Later, when the inspector passed Miss Marple's cottage and offered her a brief nod, she returned it with polite warmth. He didn't stop, not yet. But she had no doubt he would, and when he did, she would be ready, because Jane Marple was already quietly assembling her own list of glances exchanged, of words weighted with past grievances, of relationships only, half seen by others but entirely clear to her. A teacup had whispered something that morning. It had whispered fear. It had whispered urgency. And for those who knew how to listen, it had whispered the truth. Chapter 3. Whispers over china and lace, the parlor of Orchard View. Cottage was unusually hushed for a Thursday morning. Mrs. Dinah Merriweather's weekly coffee gathering, typically a boisterous affair full of cheeky laughter and shared complaints about local happenings, had shifted in mood. After all, it was the first gathering since the tragic incident Miss Fay, Eliza Blunt's garden party. The sudden and mysterious death of Harriet Flint, a young woman with more admirers than allies, had unsettled even the most resilient souls of Nether Mallow. A rain-speckled breeze slipped in through the open casement window, stirring the lace, doilies and sending the scent of Parma violets and damp earth swirling around the room. Miss Marple, perched quietly on a floral chintz chair, held her porcelain teacup delicately, her blue eyes as mild and unfocused as a pensioner pondering crossword clues. Yet, behind that seemingly distracted gaze, she was listening very carefully. Across the room, Mrs. Merriweather chattered away with the Reverend Caleb Hart's sister, Enid, and a few other ladies from the church choir. Their voices, though hushed, were thick with implication. "Of course, they say it was the tea," Mrs. Merriweather whispered. "A special blend. Harriet brought herself some fancy floral thing from London. But poison, just imagine." "Shocking," muttered Enid, her brows knitting. "And at Eliza's garden party, of all places. Poor Eliza hasn't left the house since." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, careful not to clink the spoon too loudly. It wasn't her habit to interrupt. Observing was always more profitable than leading the conversation, especially when gossip was raw and unpolished. "They say it was cyanide," added Mrs. Jane Cribbs, leaning in confidentially. "Smells like bitter almonds, you know. My brother swore he recognized the scent, but with all those flower arrangements about, well, who could be sure?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow slightly, not because of the comment, but because of who had made it. Jane Cribbs had never been known for her sensitivity to sense years of smoking. Her husband's discarded cigars had dulled her olfactory sense quite thoroughly. But the comment did pique Miss Marple's curiosity. If anyone had smelled something unusual, it would have meant the poison had been there to be noticed, perhaps even shortly before the girl collapsed. Still, Enid added, "If you ask me, it's not as if the girl didn't have enemies. That sweet face of hers masked for a viper, I always said. Took up with young Thomas Arkwright and had him dancing after her in no time. Barely 3 months since he broke off with Annie Greaves." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I always did think Annie was rather devoted, the sort who takes disappointment to heart." The room quieted at her remark. Miss Marple rarely spoke at length during these gatherings, but when she did, her words had a peculiar way of lingering. Mrs. Merriweather fidgeted with her teaspoon. "Surely you're not suggesting Annie had something to do with it, Miss Marple?" "Oh, dear me, no," Miss Marple said quickly, blinking as if surprised by her own words. "Just that. People do funny things when they feel discarded, especially if they think no one noticed their pain." The ladies glanced at one another. Miss Marple took another sip of tea and smiled benignly. The truth was, she had already noticed a few things that others had not. Later that afternoon, she paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. "I must say, Miss Marple," Reverend Hart said, ushering her into the study, "the village is in quite a state. I had half the congregation corner me after morning prayers, demanding comfort and answers in equal measure." Miss Marple nodded, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. "And what do you think of the whole business, Reverend?" The vicar sighed. Harriet was charming to some, but her attentions fluttered rather dangerously. She had a talent for getting under people's skin, and not just the young men. She had words with Eliza just 2 days before the party. Did you hear? Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Indeed?" "No, I hadn't." The vicar leaned forward. "Apparently, Harriet criticized Eliza's donations to the church flower fund. Said they were stingy for a woman with a legacy. Eliza didn't take kindly to it. Called her an impertinent little crow in the middle of the high street." Said Miss Marple. mentally filing the information away beside. Her growing list of personal grievances held against the late Miss Flint. The next morning brought a fresh drizzle and a surprising visitor to Orchard View Cottage, young Inspector Farlow from the County Constabulary. Looking rather harried beneath his rain-spattered bowler, Miss Marple, he began, clearly trying to keep the skepticism out of his tone. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word." "Of course, Inspector. Come in. You're just in time for a fresh pot of Darjeeling." Once seated, he cleared his throat and said, "You were at the party. Did you notice anything unusual before the, incident?" Miss Marple tilted her head. Only that Harriet was rather more animated than usual. She flitted from guest to guest like a butterfly, too quick for proper conversation, really, and she barely touched the cakes. Farlow frowned. "No cakes?" "No." She seemed distracted. Perhaps she was nervous. Or trying to be seen, but not spoken to. Miss Marple paused, then added gently, "May I ask, have you spoken to Annie Greaves?" The inspector narrowed his eyes slightly. "We've spoken to a number of guests, yes." "She wasn't herself at the party," Miss Marple said softly. "And she's not been seen about since. I dare say she's not the only one hiding from the public gaze, but it might be worth checking in." Farlow made a non-committal noise, stood, and thanked her politely. Yet as he left, Miss Marple noticed a tension in his shoulders that suggested her words had landed. More squarely than he let on dot as the village buzzed with speculative murmurs, Miss Marple continued to make her quiet inquiries. She spoke gently with those others had ignored maids who served at the party, the greengrocer who delivered to Eliza's house, the postman who saw young Thomas Arkwright drop a letter at Harriet's gate just a day before the party. Piece by piece, the village yielded its secrets, not with drama, but with the slow exhalation of truth that only came to those who listened closely and judged less. And amid those whispers and fragments, Miss Marple sensed the faint outline of something far more deliberate than mere romantic jealousy. Something poisoned not only the tea, but the very air of Nether Mallow. Chapter 4. Fractures beneath the surface from the teacup that whispered the truth. A Miss Marple mystery. The following day dawned with a soft drizzle brushing over the roofs of Lower Denville, painting the cobblestones in a melancholy sheen. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains at the Laurels, and Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, appeared as serene as the village itself. But the clatter of a scandal had begun to echo more loudly than the rainfall. Mrs. Edgecombe's death, so sudden, so jarring, had stirred something far deeper than shock. Word had spread fast, as it always did in villages. But this was no idle tea-table gossip. Inspector Cray had made his presence felt at once, having arrived from the nearby market town of Felburn. A man of square jaw and square opinions, he had already taken to the case with the bluntness of a constable and the pride of a general. And Miss Marple, quietly observing from the sidelines, could already see that the inspector's eye was turned in the wrong direction. Dotted, the White Pigeon, Lower Denville's only inn and watering hole, villagers were buzzing. In a corner, near the hearth, two women sat hunched together. Hester Blake, the vicar's sister, and Mrs. Blanche Gardner, widow of the late town clerk. Their voices lowered and raised like violins warming up, never quite harmonious but filled with unison and excitement. It was the arsenic. Hester whispered, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer. Dr. Bream said so, well, not said precisely, but he hinted. Arsenic in the tea. Blanche leaned closer. Then it's true what Mrs. Waddle claimed? That old Edgecombe was halfway to mad already. Perhaps it was suicide. Hester scoffed. Hardly. Did you see her face, Blanche? A woman doesn't sip her way to suicide and make such a dreadful show of it. No, it was murder. And if you ask me, I wouldn't put it past Vera. Blanche's eyes widened. The niece? But she looked after her devotedly. Ah, but you saw her at the fete. Stiff-lipped and cool as anything. And they say the will, the clink of a glass silenced. Them both. The landlord, Mr. Tolliver, passed by with a polite cough and a barely veiled smirk. Everyone in Lower Denville had theories now, and each one made for better gossip than the last. Meanwhile, Vera Edgecombe sat in the drawing room of Primrose Lodge with her hands clasped around a handkerchief. She wore a neat navy dress, plain but well kept, and her expression, though composed, bore the pallor of strain. Inspector Cray had made himself quite comfortable in the armchair opposite. "Let's go over it again, Miss Edgecombe," he said, his notebook resting on his knee. "You served your aunt her tea, you say, just after the third bell?" "Yes," Vera replied, her voice firm but devoid of warmth. "She liked it at precisely 3:30. I brought it in on the tray myself. She took it in her sitting room." "And did anyone else handle the tea before you brought it in?" She hesitated. "Only Mrs. Kettle. She brewed it, as she always did. I was in the kitchen when she poured the water into the pot." Inspector Cray scribbled something down. "And the biscuits? I took them from the tin in the pantry. Rich tea, she always liked those best." There was a pause as the inspector leaned back and regarded her. "No one else came into the room?" "No, not until I screamed, and the maids came running." Vera's face remained composed, but the way she folded her hands betrayed tension. There was something restrained about her, a control too practiced, too precise. Inspector Cray seemed to notice as well, but didn't press further. "Thank you, Miss Edgecombe. We'll be needing to speak with Mrs. Kettle again." Miss Marple, having politely excused herself from the vicarage, took her usual winding path. Toward Primrose Lodge, she did not march like a detective on a mission. Rather, she moved with gentle purpose, pausing now and then to admire the raindrops sliding down rose petals or to nod at passing neighbors. When she arrived, the housemaid Letty greeted her nervously. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know if Miss Vera's up to company." "I quite understand, Letty dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Perhaps I might see Mrs. Kettle then. I did so admire her rhubarb jam last spring. I was hoping for the recipe." Letty blinked, confused but too polite to deny her. "I'll fetch her." In the kitchen, Miss Marple found Mrs. Kettle standing stiffly near the range, her red hands clutched around a dish towel. She was not a woman given to sentiment, but there was unmistakable worry in her face. "Mrs. Kettle," Miss Marple said gently. "Such dreadful business, isn't it? And I do hope you don't think me unkind for asking, but you've always brewed Mrs. Edgecombe's tea yourself." The housekeeper nodded. "Yes, ma'am, for years. Always the same brand, Morton's Darjeeling, second flush. And she always took it plain. No sugar?" "Never. Said it spoilt the character." Miss Marple nodded. "How very particular. And yet, you prepared the pot in the kitchen yesterday?" "I did, same as always. But I'd stepped away for just a moment when Miss Vera came in." "Miss?" Marple's brows rose slightly. "She poured the water then?" No, I'd done that, but I hadn't placed the lid yet. She set the tray herself." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "That's helpful. And tell me, Mrs. Kettle, did the tea smell as it usually did?" The housekeeper paused. "Now that you mention it, perhaps a little bitter, but I thought it might have been the pot. It's old, you see." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, and thanked her, leaving the kitchen soon after. But in her mind, the kettle had begun to boil. Outside, the drizzle had thinned to mist, and the village seemed to retreat into quiet contemplation. But inside the heads of its residents, thoughts churned. There were whispers of wills and inheritances, of grudges and secrets long thought buried. Miss Marple, now walking back along the lane, considered it all: the timing, the bitterness in the pot, Vera's polished composure, and the old lady's stern adherence to her habits. A sudden flash of recollection came to her, a memory of a woman in her youth who had trained parrots and never gave them sugared treats, for it shortened their lives. That woman had also had a niece and a strong will. Poison, as Miss Marple well knew, was a weapon not of impulse, But of calculation. She passed the rosebush outside the vicarage and paused to straighten a drooping bloom. In Lower Denville. Nothing bloomed or withered without someone taking notice, and Miss Marple always noticed. Chapter 5. Shadows of Motive. From the teacup that whispered the truth. A Miss Marple mystery. The sun broke through the morning clouds the next day, dappling the streets of Lower Denville with a fragile warmth that did little to lift the mood thickening across the village. In the vicarage garden, the bees droned lazily among the lavender, and Miss Marple sat with her embroidery frame in her lap. She wasn't sewing. Rather, she was quietly watching the world pass through the narrow lane before her, eyes alike beneath the calm exterior of her pale blue bonnet. It was not the rain that unsettled her now. It was the silence that had followed it. A murder had taken place. Of that much, Miss Marple was now certain. The tragic death of Mrs. Edgecombe was no natural passing, no sad collapse of age. It was designed. And though poison was an intimate, quiet method, its presence in a cup of afternoon tea revealed much. To the one who truly listened. At Primrose Lodge, Inspector Cray had returned that morning for a more pointed conversation. He was less patient now. Overnight, Dr. Bream had returned with more definitive toxicology, arsenic in small, consistent quantities. Not a single massive dose, but a slow, deliberate accumulation. Reaching a fatal point, he laid it out bluntly before Vera. Miss Edgecombe, someone has been introducing arsenic into your aunt's system over time. The final dose yesterday was simply the culmination. Vera's face remained unreadable. I see. You seem remarkably calm. I believe my aunt would have appreciated composure, she replied smoothly. We were not a household of hysterics. Cray gave a soft grunt. Be that as it may, this now confirms murder. And unfortunately for you, Miss Edgecombe, you were closest to the deceased, had access to her food and drink, and by all accounts would inherit the majority of her estate. Vera didn't flinch. My inheritance is largely tied up in property. She left minor legacies to various charities. There is little in the way of liquid assets. Still, he pressed, motives don't always hinge on wealth. Sometimes it's resentment or control. Was there bad blood between you? No, she said, folding her arms neatly. She could be exacting, yes, demanding, but we got unwell enough to look after her full time. I had no choice, she said after a moment. There was no one else. Her words carried a veiled weariness, and for the first time, the inspector noted something close to resentment. Just a trace, but poison too, worked in traces. Later that afternoon, Vera took a walk through the village lanes, her gloved hands, holding a small bouquet of delphiniums she had picked from the side path near Red Willow Hill. She hadn't meant to encounter Miss Marple, but the elderly woman had a habit of appearing at precisely the moment one most wished to be alone. Such a lovely color, Miss Marple said, gently touching the purple-blue petals. Delphiniums always remind me of Lady Calthorpe's funeral. So stately yet fragile, don't you find? Vera managed a polite nod. Miss Marple's tone remained airy, even pleasant. I wonder, dear, do you think it's difficult to care for someone who has ceased being themselves? Someone who becomes a shadow of who they were? Vera gave her a sidelong glance. It depends on the person and the depth of affection. Indeed, I remember my cousin Millicent cared for her father, a terror of a man truly, for 7 years until his passing. I asked her once how she managed, and she said, I imagined I was repaying a debt from a past life. It was the only way I could make peace with the resentment. Vera didn't reply, but the delphiniums trembled slightly in her grip. Miss Marple offered a soft smile. Are you walking toward the churchyard? I was. May I join you a little way? I find the quiet there so soothing after a morning of town chatter. With no polite way to decline, Vera acquiesced, and they walked in companionable silence. The path wound along a low stone wall, beyond which the churchyard sat in drowsy calm. A blackbird called once from a nearby ash tree. As they entered the gate, Miss Marple stopped to examine the headstone of a Major Brackley. "Funny how certain names stick with you," she murmured. "Did you know him?" "No," Vera replied softly. "He died before I moved here." "You've only lived in Lower Denville a few years, haven't you?" "Since 1939. I moved in with Aunt when her health began to wane." "Such a noble thing to do, uprooting yourself like that." "Not everyone would, especially not someone with prospects elsewhere." Vera gave her a tired glance. "There weren't many prospects. I trained in secretarial work, but the war changed everything. Besides, family is family." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, though sometimes duty wears heavier than affection. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Reverend Blake sat at his writing desk, frowning over a letter he had pulled from the post that morning. His sister Hester bustled into the study with a pot of tea. "You're frowning, Andrew. Is it that letter? From Miss Fane again?" "No, this is from the solicitor's office in Felburn, about Mrs. Edgecombe's bequest to the church." Hester blinked. "She left the church something?" He nodded, brow still furrowed. £200. "But here's the thing. She changed her will 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks? "Yes, the original will, dated 1942, left the bulk of the estate to Vera and certain donations to local causes. But the revised version reduced Vera's share substantially and added several unexpected beneficiaries." Hester leaned forward. "Including you." The vicar gave her a hard look. "I refused to be drawn into that insinuation. I had no idea. But still, what would make her do that?" The vicar tapped his fingers against the envelope. "I don't know, but perhaps Miss Marple might." And indeed, Miss Marple had already heard of the altered will, though not from the vicar. She had heard it from young Walter Chittenden, the apprentice at Mr. Beadle's legal office in Felburn. A dear boy with hay-colored hair and an unfortunate fondness for raspberry bonbons. He had run into her the day prior, and with very little prompting, spoken of the odd bequests in the new Edgecombe testament. Miss Marple now sat at her table, sipping nettle tea and reviewing her own mental list. Mrs. Edgecombe had enemies. That much was clear. There was Vera, loyal, poised, and possibly resentful. There was Mrs. Kettle, fiercely devoted, but secretive in her way. The vicar now had a motive he likely didn't even know about. And the beneficiaries of the altered will extended beyond him, one of the village charities, a girls' school in Kent, and a curious £75 left to an E. Dower, whose identity remained a mystery. But what truly held Miss Marple's attention now was the pattern. Someone had dosed Mrs. Edgecombe with arsenic, not all at once, but over time, in small, unnoticeable doses. That suggested access, regular proximity, and a certain patience. But more importantly, a plan. She rose slowly from her chair and went to the writing bureau. From its top drawer, she withdrew a letter, one she had received from an old friend at the London College of Pharmacy just last week. It was about a rather curious purchase made by a villager not 2 months prior. A compound containing arsenic, signed for under the pretense of garden pest control. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. The whisper in the teacup had begun to form. Words. Chapter 6. Whispers on the Green. Next morning dawned in Lower Denville, with a pale gold light, pressing through a gauze of mist that lingered stubbornly over the meadows and the cobbled lanes. The village, still slightly unsettled by the news of Mrs. Edgecombe's altered will and mysterious death, seemed to hold its collective breath. At Hillside View, Miss Marple had already completed her morning walk by the time the post arrived. Her eyes lit gently at the sight of the single letter placed upon her hall table, a missive from Walter Chittenden, the retired churchwarden whose memory was as precise as his handwriting. She broke the seal and read it at once. My dear Miss Marple, regarding your inquiry into the man named Edwin Dower, I can confirm he was once employed at the church some 20 years ago. groundskeeper and occasional bell ringer. A sullen man, if you'll forgive me saying so. Quiet, brooding. Let go under suspicion of theft from the offertory box, though nothing was ever proven. He vanished from the village shortly after. Some said he'd taken up work in Exeter. I doubt anyone's seen him since. I do recall Mrs. Edgecombe speaking of him once. She said, "A man with a very long memory can be either dangerous or loyal." I've yet to decide which Mr. Dower was. Yours sincerely, Walter Chittenden. Miss Marple pursed her lips. The past never truly died in a village like Lower Denville. It merely waited behind a hedge until someone came walking by with the wrong expression or the wrong recollection. Edwin Dower might be long gone, but his name, surfacing in the will so unexpectedly, must mean something. And then there was the matter of the funeral. The service was set for the following morning. Reverend Blake, having sought further counsel from the bishop and Miss Marple, agreed, albeit uneasily, to honor the request concerning the sealed letter. "I shall read it," he told Miss Marple quietly as they stood outside the church that afternoon. "But only if its contents do not put the dignity of the pulpit or the privacy of others at risk." "Quite right," Miss Marple nodded. "But I do suspect Mrs. Edgecombe meant for it to be read aloud precisely because she felt no other voice would carry the weight of her truth." They both turned then at the sound of approaching footsteps. It was Mary, the part-time cleaner from Primrose Lodge, a girl of about 20 with freckles and a nervous air about her. She clutched a paper parcel of lavender soap to her chest and stopped short when she saw them. "Oh, Miss Marple, Reverend, I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting, Mary," Miss Marple said kindly. "Would you walk with me a moment?" "Just to the gate." Mary nodded hesitantly, falling into step beside her. "You clean for Mrs. Edgecombe on Mondays and Thursdays, is that right?" "Yes, ma'am. Just a few hours each time. Mostly tidying, dusting, polishing the brass. Did you ever prepare her tea?" "Not usually. Only once, maybe twice. Vera handled that most days. Were you there the day Mrs. Edgecombe passed away?" Mary's eyes flickered. "No, ma'am. I was there the day before, though." "Thursday. Everything seemed normal then. She was in her chair reading the Illustrated London News. Kept asking about the tea caddy. Said she'd misplaced the little silver spoon she liked." "I didn't see it anywhere." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Did you ever see her quarrel with Vera?" "Oh no, but sometimes when Vera wasn't looking, the old lady would pull faces behind her." "I shouldn't say that, should I?" "It's quite all right. Truth is like dandelion fluff. Mary, it flies whether we intend it or not." Mary looked uncertain but nodded. "I hope they find out what really happened. Mrs. Edgecombe scared me a bit, but she didn't deserve ... you know." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, pausing at the gate. "Thank you, dear." As Mary disappeared around the curve of the path, Miss Marple turned back to Reverend Blake. "The silver spoon," she murmured. "How often it is the little things that tell us more than the loud ones." That evening, as dusk settled over, the village and windows glowed with the warm hush of lamps and supper. A quiet conversation took place inside the drawing room of Primrose Lodge. Vera Edgecombe sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, facing two unexpected visitors, Inspector Cray and Miss Marple. Cray began. "Miss Edgecombe, you're aware by now that we've begun examining your aunt's will closely. Several peculiarities have emerged." Vera folded her arms. "Peculiar in what way?" "Well," Cray said slowly, "besides the sum left to Edwin Dower, your aunt also specified that her old writing bureau, kept locked in the blue bedroom, was to go to the vicar. Not for its value, she noted, but for what was within it." Vera blinked. "That bureau's been locked for years. Aunt didn't let anyone near it. We forced it open this afternoon," Cray said. "Inside, we found a bundle of old correspondences, many of them rather unremarkable, but also a handwritten diary, one she began only 6 weeks ago." Vera's eyes widened. Miss Marple spoke now, her voice low but measured. She mentioned in that diary that she suspected someone close to her was stealing small items, an ivory brooch, a sovereign from a jar, her silver teaspoon. She believed it was someone with regular access and a motive. Vera stared at her. "Are you suggesting I—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. She didn't believe it was you, nor Mary, nor any stranger. She believed it was someone from the past, someone returning. She wrote, "I feel his eyes on me again. As I did in '09, it may not be over." Cray added, "Your aunt evidently believed someone named Edwin Dower had returned, or was threatening her. But we've no records of his recent presence here." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "his name appears in the will." Vera's hands tightened around the edge of her shawl. "You think he killed her?" "We don't know," Cray said. "But we intend to find out." That night, as a pale rain began to fall, soaking the thatch and leaving pearls upon the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat by her window once more. Her knitting needles lay untouched. Her thoughts circled like quiet crows around three things: the missing silver spoon, the sealed letter to be read at the funeral, the man who may have returned after 20 years either to claim something or to silence someone, and somewhere within those elements, truth waited impatient and near. Chapter 6. The letter and the lingered glance the next. Morning brought a sky of gentle blue, and the scent of wet lavender rising from the hedgerows that framed the lanes of Lower Denville. Birds chirped high in the sycamores, as if unaware that the village below stood on the very edge of some quiet storm. Miss Marple had risen early, as she often did when her mind worked on questions still without answers. She moved about Hillside, View with her usual efficiency boiling the kettle, slicing a wedge of currant loaf, and carefully pinning her lace collar in place. Yet her thoughts remained on the letter Mrs. Edgecombe had left behind. A letter to be read aloud at her funeral. Such things were not unknown in villages like these, where pride, regret, and secrets often outlived the bodies that carried them. But Miss Marple had a sense and instinct cultivated over many long years that this particular letter would not simply offer closure. It would stir something up. By 10:30, she was already walking toward the vicarage, the morning sun warming her back and dappling the gravel paths through the trees. Reverend Blake welcomed her into the study with a grave nod. The sealed envelope, pale and aged like bone, rested on his writing desk. "I have not opened it," he said solemnly. "Not even held it long. But I'm to read it at the end of the funeral service, in accordance with her final request." Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She must have written it with great deliberation. "I don't suppose she told you anything about its contents in life?" "No, only that it would explain certain things, and that she wished it read." "In God's house." He hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "May I confess something, Miss Marple? This whole affair troubles me deeply. Not only her death, but the unease that settled over the village like fog. It's as though people expect something dreadful." Miss Marple's expression did not shift, perhaps because something dreadful has already occurred, and they've only just realized it. He blinked at her, uncertain. She rose gently. "If I may make a suggestion, Reverend, before the service tomorrow, perhaps you might consider reading the letter once, privately." He frowned, but she said, "I understand, and I would never ask a man of faith to disregard a solemn request. But if the letter contains anything libelous, or dangerous, or false, better you know in advance." He gave a slow nod. "You speak wisely, as always." Miss Marple offered a small smile. "One does try." Back in the village, word of the altered will had, unsurprisingly, begun to circulate. It moved subtly spoken in undertones over the grocer's counter, or murmured behind fluttering curtains. Mrs. Pettigrew, always at the center of every conversational knot, was heard proclaiming outside the post office, Well, I always said Vera Edgecombe was a bit too fond of her aunt's pearls. Walked about like a duchess, she did, fingering the garnet brooch and pretending she'd inherited it by merit. And now look, the whole estate turned upside down for some Edwin ... whoever he is. Vera must be furious, murmured another voice. Oh, positively seething, I'd wager. She marched to the solicitor's yesterday afternoon, face like chalk, lips like iron. Behind that particular hedge of gossip, Miss Marple passed quietly and unnoticed. She was not one to dismiss local chatter, but she understood its rhythm. For every true note struck, a false one followed. Her task, as ever, was to separate the music from the noise. By early afternoon, Miss Marple found herself again on Poppy Lane. Primrose Lodge stood with its same blind windows and silent garden, though now something about it seemed ... expectant. Vera Edgecombe answered the door, her smile stiff and eyes puffy, as if sleep had fled from her bedside the night before. Miss Marple, she said evenly. I didn't expect. I shan't keep you long, the older woman said warmly. I simply wanted to offer you this. She held out a small wrapped packet, lemon biscuits, tied with blue ribbon. Vera blinked. That's very kind. No trouble at all. I thought perhaps with the arrangements and visitors, you might not have time to bake. Vera accepted the parcel with a nod of thanks, but her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed Miss Marple's hand. Miss Marple, she said, voice lowering, do you believe there's something wrong with the will? Miss Marple tilted her head. I believe your aunt made certain choices that surprised others. As to whether they were right or wrong, well, that depends on whose story is being told. Vera's eyes narrowed. She'd grown paranoid these last few months, saying strange things. That someone from her past was watching her. She even accused me of misplacing a brooch, which I later found at the bottom of her knitting basket. Paranoia. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. But sometimes, the paranoid are simply those who've begun to notice what others haven't. There was a silence between them, thin and taut. Finally, Vera stepped back. Thank you for the biscuits. And thank you for the conversation. That evening, the village square was aglow with lanterns as preparations for the flower festival began, an old tradition, originally meant to honor St. Ethelwyn's feast day, but now more an excuse for bunting and rhubarb jam contests. Children rehearsed dances on the green. The local WI arranged dahlias and foxgloves into baskets shaped like lambs. But beneath it all, there was tension, a subtle disquiet that tugged at conversations and clouded pleasantries down at the edge of the crowd. Miss Marple observed it all. She watched the way Vera Edgecombe lingered too long at the church gate. The way Reverend Blake, normally so sociable, seemed withdrawn. Even Mrs. Pettigrew, usually brimming with hyperbole, now whispered more than she spoke. There was something in the air. As Miss Marple turned to leave, a voice stopped her. A man's voice, low, unfamiliar. Begging your pardon, ma'am. Are you ... Miss Marple? She turned. The man was thin, his coat several years out of fashion, his hands calloused. His eyes, pale gray, watched her not with suspicion, but recognition. I believe I've come across something that belonged to the lady of Primrose Lodge. Something she may have wanted you to see. Miss Marple regarded him quietly, and, who might you be, mister? He hesitated. Name's Dower, ma'am. Edwin Dower. Chapter 7. Edwin Dower's tale. Miss Marple regarded the man before her with a level gaze, her eyes assessing every crease in his weathered face, every twitch of his fingers. His voice had been steady, but she detected a tremor, not of fear perhaps, but of restrained emotion. The name Edwin Dower still rang in her ears, not yet fully seated in her mind. I see, she said softly. You must be the man mentioned in Mrs. Edgecombe's revised will. Edwin Dower gave a short, nervous nod. Didn't expect to be, truth told. They stood together on the edge of the green, lantern light flickering across the grass and catching in the folds of Miss Marple's shawl. Children's laughter floated from the far side of the square, incongruous against the heaviness settling between them. "Would you walk with me for a moment, Mr. Dower?" she asked. He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Reckon I can manage." That. They strolled slowly down the narrow lane that led past the churchyard, its low stone wall lined with evening primroses. Miss Marple walked with her usual measured pace, allowing silence to settle between them like a carefully laid cloth dot at last. She spoke. "Forgive my forwardness, Mr. Dower, but in a village such as this, people tend to notice when a stranger appears, particularly one suddenly named in a will." He let out a breath. "I don't blame them. It's complicated, I suppose." "Complicated is often simply another word for delayed truth," Miss Marple said gently. Dower smiled faintly. "You've a turn of phrase, ma'am." She inclined her head. "Now then, why don't you begin at the beginning?" He took a moment, clearly organizing his thoughts. "I was born in Leeds," he began, his accent soft but distinctly northern. "Mother worked at a factory. Father was gone before I knew him. Never had much, but I managed all right. Grew up decent, kept to myself." Miss Marple listened attentively. "When I was about 10, he continued, a woman came to visit our lodgings, said she was a distant relation. Brought me a toy train and a pair of shoes. Said she'd been watching over us." He swallowed hard. "Didn't see her again until I was 18. I'd just left school and was working in a warehouse. She came by and asked me to have tea. Told me then that she was my aunt, my father's sister." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "She gave her name as Vera?" "No, ma'am. She said her name was Eleanor Edgecombe." That settled the matter. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with understanding. "She offered me money then," Edwin said. "Enough to keep me in better lodgings, get a few things straight. But I turned her down. Sighed I didn't want anything from anyone I didn't know." He paused. "She respected that, I think. But she gave me an address, said if I ever needed help, I was to write. I never did. Not until last December." "And what made you write then, Mr. Dower?" His gaze drifted downward. "I'd lost work. Things had gone bad. I was ill for a while, and after that, well, everything collapsed. Pride's a funny thing, Miss Marple. It'll keep you warm until it doesn't." "Yes," she said gently. "And hunger has a way of softening the sharpest pride." He nodded. "So I wrote. Saw it I didn't want charity, just a chance." She replied within the week. Said she'd been waiting, that she was glad I'd reached out. Invited me here. "And did you come?" "I did. I arrived in early January, stayed in the village for 3 days, though I didn't stay at her house. We met privately. She asked me about my life, my work, my health. She was kind. Not motherly, exactly, but protective. She said she had regrets." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but inwardly her mind turned over this revelation. A secret family connection. A young man previously unknown. And an elderly woman perhaps looking to right a wrong before death claimed her. "Did she tell you why she'd kept your existence a secret?" she asked. Edwin shook his head. "Only said that it would upset others, that not everyone was ready for the truth." "Did she mention her niece Vera?" He hesitated. "Only to say that she had her own expectations about the future of the estate, and that things might get awkward if the will changed." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, "Mr. Dower, do you know whether Mrs. Edgecombe changed her will before or after your visit?" "She said she'd done it just after, sent word to her solicitor. But she warned me not to say anything. Said the truth would come out in time, but not by me." As they neared the edge of the lane, the lights of the green now distant behind them, Miss Marple turned toward him with deliberate calm. "One last question, Mr. Dower, if I may. Why now? Why approach me?" He gave a helpless shrug. "I came to attend the funeral, out of respect. But there's something else." Something I found in my lodging before I left." He reached into his coat and withdrew a thin envelope. "She sent this to me. It arrived 2 days ago. Postmarked Denville. But the handwriting's not hers." Miss Marple accepted the envelope with care. Her fingers traced the edge. No name on the outside, only the initials EED scrawled in the lower corner. She opened it and removed a single sheet of cream paper. Inside was a short note, typed on. "A manual machine. Do not trust those who smile too readily. The brooch was only the beginning. Look beneath the lilacs." Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time. The brooch. Vera had mentioned it had gone missing, then turned up again. And now this. "Look beneath the lilacs. Have you shown this to anyone else?" she asked. "No," Edwin said. "Didn't know what to make of it." "You were right to bring it to me," she said, folding the letter and tucking it carefully into her handbag. "And I suggest for now that you remain unobtrusive. Do not let anyone know you're staying in the village. There are still things at play here, shadows if you will, that haven't yet stepped fully into the light." He looked uncertain. "You think there's danger?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that someone is afraid. And when fear and inheritance meet, Mr. Dower, they often shake hands with something very much like malice." Later that evening, as the moon rose silver over the rooftops and the sounds of the festival faded into hush, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room and looked again at the note. The reference to the lilacs stirred a memory, something from the garden at Primrose Lodge, a curved stone bench beneath a large flowering bush, a place where the shade fell deep, even in daylight. She reached for her diary and noted the detail. Then, almost absently, she looked to the fireplace mantel, where a faded photograph of her late nephew Raymond sat in a silver frame. "Human nature," she murmured aloud. "Always so very dependable in its inconsistencies." She closed her eyes. Somewhere she knew the next clue waited, perhaps beneath lilacs, perhaps in words not yet spoken. But it was closer than anyone suspected. Chapter 8. Beneath the Lilacs. The morning after the midsummer fete dawned unusually overcast, a pale sky pressing low upon the rooftops of Denville St. Mary, the bunting that had fluttered so gaily. The day before now drooped damply along fences and garden hedges, as if exhausted by too much mirth. At Primrose Lodge, a house once cheered by tidy gardens and a neatly swept walk, all seemed still but faintly expectant, as though the very bricks were holding their breath. Miss Marple stood at her window, teacup in hand, and watched as a solitary blackbird hopped across the lawn. Her thoughts were not with birds, however, but with brooches and bushes and the odd, unsigned note typed by a trembling hand. Look beneath the lilacs. She had always believed that certain messages, particularly those wrapped in ambiguity, were better followed than explained. Her instincts, as much as her deductions, told her that time was tightening around this village, like a noose gently tugged at 10:30. Miss Marple arrived at Primrose Lodge. The door was opened not by Vera, but by the housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a little wary. I'm afraid Miss Edgecombe isn't receiving callers this morning. She's had something of a headache since last night." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But I hope to retrieve a handkerchief I may have dropped during the fete. I remember sitting on the stone bench in the side garden. Might I step through to check?" Mrs. Tilling hesitated, torn between discretion and habit. "Well, not if it's only the garden." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "I won't trouble the house at all." She was ushered through the hall and out the side door. Without fanfare, the garden path wound through borders of overgrown lavender and early summer roses, past a tangle of foxglove and peony, until it reached the corner plot shaded by a pair of lilac bushes, now heavy with their pale, fragrant clusters. And there it was, the bench, curved, carved of local stone, and spotted with damp moss on one side. She stepped forward, her gaze carefully scanning the earth beneath the lilacs. Grass gave way to soft soil, recently disturbed. At a glance, it could have been explained by ordinary gardening, but Miss Marple noticed what others would not. Irregularity in the spade marks, the faint trail of crushed twigs leading from the garden shed. She crouched slowly, her knees creaking faintly beneath her long tweed skirt, and began gently brushing away the soil with her gloved hand. Within moments, something metallic gleamed against the dark earth. It was a small tin, an old tobacco tin, dented and rusted at the corners. Carefully she opened it. Inside lay two items, a silver brooch, unmistakably antique, shaped like a spray of laurel leaves and glinting dully in the clouded light, and a torn corner of paper bearing just 4 words in faded ink. "You'll pay." For this, Miss Marple's brows knitted ever so slightly. She replaced the brooch and note, closed the tin, and reburied it with care, marking its position with a dislodged twig. She would return later, ideally when Vera was not pacing the upstairs bedroom, waiting with a headache or otherwise. Returning to the lane, Miss Marple nearly collided with young Inspector Lockhart, who was approaching with long, purposeful strides and a rather rumpled expression. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised. "Out for a stroll?" "Quite," she replied, brushing a leaf from her coat. "And yourself?" "I've just come from the post office. There's been another complaint about someone tampering with parcels. Nothing serious, but odd given the circumstances." "Do you mean someone's been opening letters?" "Packages, actually. Several left on doorsteps or posted for delivery have turned up opened. Nothing missing, just ... looked through." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Looking for something, perhaps? Could be. You've a theory?" "I have several," she said thoughtfully. "But tell me, Inspector, has anything more come to light about Mrs. Edgecombe's will?" Lockhart exhaled, walking beside her now. "Funny you ask. It seems the revised version was indeed registered, though the solicitor only found the filed amendment 2 days ago. It names Edwin Dower as a beneficiary significantly, in fact. Nearly half the estate," Miss Marple nodded. "And the rest remains with Miss Vera? For now. But it seems there's been contention. The solicitor mentioned Vera was quite shocked when informed." "Shocked," Miss Marple echoed. "Or aware and feigning ignorance? That's where your intuition comes in, I suppose," Lockhart said with a grin. "Mine only takes me so far with these village matters. They are rather more intricate than they appear," she agreed. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the village church. She wasn't particularly religious in a ceremonial sense, but she often found that truth, and those who sought to avoid it, had a curious habit of circling holy ground. She was not surprised to find Vera Edgecombe seated alone in one of the back pews, her posture stiff and unreadable. "Miss Edgecombe," Miss Marple said softly as she approached. "May I join you?" Vera turned, startled, but then offered a faint nod. "Of course. Though I can't say I'm in the most sociable of moods." "I dare say not," Miss Marple replied. "I remember when my cousin was displaced in her mother's will by a distant nephew. It caused quite a stir in Tillingford." Vera's expression tightened. "So you've heard." "Word travels, as it must," said Miss Marple. "But I believe there's a great deal more traveling silently beneath the surface." "For instance, what happened to the brooch?" Vera turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "I refer to the silver laurel brooch that went missing before the funeral. You said it had turned up, did you not?" "Yes, in one of Mother's drawers." "I see. And did you put it there?" Vera's eyes flashed. "Certainly not. Then who did?" She stood abruptly, the echo of her footsteps ringing along the stone floor. "You think I'm lying?" "I think," said Miss Marple calmly, "that someone wanted the brooch out of sight. Perhaps because it was connected to something else. Perhaps because of what it might prove." Vera's fists clenched. "That tin ... that horrid little box ... You found it, didn't you?" Miss Marple did not reply. Vera looked away, her voice lowering. I thought it was just a petty threat at first. A nasty note slipped into my coat pocket one morning when I was in the garden. I didn't tell anyone. I buried the tin because I was frightened. I didn't know who might have seen me near the drawer ... near the safe. I didn't take anything. I swear it, but someone clearly wants me to think otherwise. And you believe the brooch was planted? I don't know what to believe anymore, she whispered. Later that evening, as twilight settled in shades of violet and gray over Denville St. Mary, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, her mind weaving the threads together with slow, deliberate care. A buried tin, a threatening note, a concealed will, a man long hidden and now unearthed. And somewhere, someone was watching closely, perhaps too closely. She now felt certain that the true danger lay not in what had been revealed, but in what was still buried. As she lit a small lamp beside her writing desk, she made one final notation in her diary for the evening. The key lies not with who wanted the money, but with who feared the truth. And beneath that, a second line. Tomorrow ask Mrs. Tilling what she saw on the night of the brooch's disappearance. Chapter 9. The housekeeper's watchful eyes. The morning broke with a fine mist rising from the meadows beyond Denville St. Mary, casting a soft haze over the village rooftops. Church bells rang distantly through the damp air, as if summoning not just the faithful, but secrets reluctant to rise from their graves. At the hearth of her snug cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat beside the fire with her knitting, although her fingers barely moved. She was pondering a most delicate matter. The tin beneath the lilacs, the torn note, the sudden revelation of Edwin Dower in Mrs. Edgecombe's will, each was a thread. But the tapestry had yet to be made clear. And then there was Mrs. Tilling, a woman often overlooked, but never by Miss Marple. It was just past 10 when she made her way once more to Primrose Lodge. The sky above was low and colorless, and the house looked more austere than ever, its ivy clinging a little too tightly to the stone. Mrs. Tilling herself answered the door. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, adjusting her apron. "Miss Edgecombe is resting again this morning. I shan't disturb her," Miss Marple said gently. "Actually, I wondered if I might have a word with you about the late Mrs. Edgecombe." Mrs. Tilling hesitated. What about her exactly? Miss Marple glanced around. Perhaps in the kitchen? I wouldn't like to be caught standing on the threshold gossiping. After a moment's pause, the housekeeper nodded and led her inside. The kitchen was warm with the scent of freshly boiled water and a faint trace of lavender floor polish. A clock ticked on the wall, steady and slow. Mrs. Tilling poured tea without asking. "I know it's not my place," she began after a long sip, "but I always said there'd be trouble when the old lady passed. All that money and no real family to speak of." "Miss Vera is her adopted daughter," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes, and Edwin Dower her what? Former pupil?" Mrs. Tilling sniffed. "More than one person in this house thought he was angling for more than piano lessons, I can tell you. You were here on the night of the fete," Miss Marple said. "I wonder, did you happen to notice whether Miss Vera entered the study before the brooch went missing?" Mrs. Tilling's fingers tightened around her teacup. "She did, right after supper. Said she needed one of the hymn books from the cabinet. But I'll tell you what's odd. When I went in later to dust, I noticed the little wall safe was slightly ajar." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "The wall safe?" Mrs. Tilling nodded. "Behind that painting of the dogs playing cards. Always hated that thing. Do you know if the brooch had been kept in there?" "I believe so," she said. "Mrs. Edgecombe was particular about her valuables. Kept her late husband's medals and old cufflinks in there too. Vera said she never went near the thing, but I wonder." Miss Marple considered this in silence, her knitting resting forgotten. On her lap, "You said you noticed the safe was open. Was anything missing besides the brooch?" "Not that I saw, but ... Mrs. Tilling hesitated again. There was a torn envelope on the floor. I picked it up and binned it, thought nothing of it at the time. "Did you notice the writing? Typed," she said, "not handwritten." I remember that because we rarely get typed letters here. I assumed it was something to do with the fate, perhaps a list of donors. But Miss Marple was not so sure. Later that day, she visited the church office to speak with Reverend Prowse, a gentle-faced man with a balding head and deep-set eyes that always seemed to be peering into the soul. "Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, "twice in 1 week. I'm honored. I was hoping for a moment of your time, if you're not too busy rearranging flower schedules. Always a pleasure. What's on your mind?" She folded her hands neatly. "I wonder if you recall a particular funeral, Mrs. Edgecombe's." He nodded solemnly. "Of course, a dignified affair. I remember seeing Edwin Dower speaking to you that day. He asked for a prayer," Prowse said softly, "for strength. I found it rather moving." "Did he say anything unusual?" "Only that he felt the burden of unfinished business." I assumed he meant his years away from the village. Miss Marple was quiet a moment. "Did he strike you as a man mourning a benefactress or something more?" The Reverend smiled faintly. "That's rather a Miss Marple question, if I may say so." She returned the smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." By mid-afternoon, clouds had thickened into a low, sulking sky. Miss Marple decided it was time to call on Edwin Dower. His rooms at Briar House overlooked a hedgerow tangled with blackberries and nettle, the paint on the window, frames peeling like old parchment. Edwin greeted her with his usual soft-spoken charm. "Miss Marple, how delightful. Won't you come in?" She did, eyes sweeping the modest room. Sheet music lay scattered on a side table. A small typewriter perched in the corner, its ribbon inky and fresh. Her eyes lingered on it just a second, longer than polite. "I wanted to return a volume of Keats you lent me years ago," she said, setting a worn book on the table. "You must think me terrible." "Not at all," he smiled. "That volume got me through some lean winters in London." She settled into the armchair he offered and accepted a lukewarm cup of tea. "I suppose you've heard about the will." He nodded, his smile fading. "It wasn't my doing, I assure you. Constance revised it shortly before her illness worsened." "I protested, actually. Did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I knew it would cause strife. Vera resents me already. This has only deepened the wound." "And yet," she said, "you've stayed in the village." "I came to say goodbye, originally. But when she passed, I felt rooted, as if I'd been summoned back for a reason." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she summon you, Mr. Dower, or did someone else?" Edwin was silent for a beat too long. "I received a letter," he admitted, "postmarked from London. Typed. It said simply, 'Come back before it's too late.' No signature. I thought perhaps it was from Constance, was it? I suppose I'll never know." But Miss Marple was not so sure of that. That evening, back in her parlor, she laid out the pieces before her in her mind like a chessboard. The brooch, the note, the safe, a typed envelope in the bin, a hidden will, a typed anonymous letter to Edwin Dower, and a piano teacher with reasons, both noble and shadowed, for returning to a village steeped in secrets. There was more. There had to be. Someone had gone to great lengths to control the narrative of Constance Edgecombe's death. And now that Vera was beginning to crack, Miss Marple sensed the true danger was approaching. She would not have to wait long. Chapter 10. Whispers Through. The glass the following morning brought with it a strange quietness to the village, a hush not born of peace, but of hesitation. The kind that comes when neighbors begin to look at each other, not just with curiosity, but with suspicion. At Primrose Lodge, the tension in the drawing room was nearly visible. Miss Vera Edgecombe sat at the writing desk, her shoulders tight, fingers nervously twisting a pearl earring. Across from her sat Dr. Aldridge, his hat still in hand, his manner uncharacteristically stiff. "I didn't ask for a doctor," Vera said, barely hiding her irritation. "No," said Aldridge mildly, "but Mrs. Tilling did. She mentioned your appetite had diminished and you've had trouble sleeping. She worries for you." "Mrs. Tilling worries for the house more than me. She worries for what's left of it," he replied. "And I would too. Vera, you're not yourself," she stiffened. "You don't know me well enough to make that claim." He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he folded his hands over his hat. "I believe you are carrying a weight, perhaps something you haven't told the police, or Miss Marple." She glanced sharply at him. "You'd be wise to confide in her. Miss Marple has a remarkable way of knowing what to do with broken pieces." But Vera's face shut down, her expression drawing inward like a turtle into its shell. "You can see yourself out, Doctor." Meanwhile, Miss Marple was on her way to the post office. It wasn't letters she was after, but people. Mrs. Biddy Harwood, the postmistress of 30 years, was a quiet woman who remembered every parcel that had passed through her hands with astonishing clarity. She wore a cardigan buttoned too tightly and glasses that perpetually slipped down. Her nose. Miss Marple inquired, very gently, whether any letters had come through addressed to Edwin Dower prior to Mrs. Edgecombe's death. "Oh yes," said Biddy, tilting her head thoughtfully. "A single envelope typed. I remember because the return address space was blank, and the stamp was ever so slightly off-center. Strange little thing." "Do you recall when it arrived?" Biddy nodded slowly. "Roughly a week before the fate. I marked it down because of the odd spacing of the address. Do you still have the dispatch book?" "Of course. We never discard before 2 years are up." She retrieved it from beneath the counter and flipped through until she landed on the right date. Miss Marple squinted at the entry. There it was. "Mr. Edwin Dower, Briar House, from London, no return," typed. "Do you recall who collected it?" "Mr. Dower himself." Miss Marple thanked her with warm politeness and made her way to the door, pausing at the threshold. Double quotes. "Oh, just one more thing," she said casually. "Has Miss Vera Edgecombe received any typed mail recently?" Biddy blinked. "Funny you ask. One just yesterday. Plain white envelope. I thought it odd. Miss Edgecombe usually prefers correspondence by hand." Miss Marple's brows knitted slightly. "You didn't happen to see the postmark?" "Same as the one for Mr. Dower's London. No return address again." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple unfolded her notebook and gently pressed her pen to a fresh page. She began outlining a chain of events, not yet certain in all details, but enough to see a shadow forming. Timeline. Key correspondence. 6 days before fate. Edwin receives anonymous typed letter. Day of fate. Vera seen entering study. Brooch disappears. 2 days after fate. We'll read. Edwin named as beneficiary. Now, Vera receives anonymous typed letter from same unknown sender. She paused. What sort of mind sends typed letters? With no return address. Always from London. Always with just enough distance to sow confusion, but not enough to vanish entirely? It was time, she thought, to follow the trail beyond St. Mary Denville. But before she could arrange a visit to London, or have someone else make inquiries, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Tilling holding her coat tight. Around her, I shouldn't be here, the housekeeper whispered, but I can't bear it anymore. There's something you need to see. Miss Marple followed her under a veil of mist to Primrose Lodge, where Mrs. Tilling led her down the back staircase and into a seldom-used linen closet off the east hallway. She bent, reached behind a stack of folded winter throws, and withdrew a small wooden box. I found it under Miss Vera's bed, she whispered. I know I shouldn't snoop, but things haven't felt right. Not since that night. Miss Marple took the box gently, opened the lid and froze. Inside lay the missing brooch. Not just the brooch, but several other small items, an antique silver hair comb, a gold locket Miss Edgecombe had once worn, and a stack of letters bound with a faded blue ribbon. Letters? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Tilling nodded. They're all addressed to Constance, all from the same person, and all signed with the initial R. Miss Marple took one and examined the signature. The handwriting was elegant, masculine clearly. Someone who cared about presentation. This one mentions our secret in Chelsea. She murmured. Mrs. Tilling looked grave. Do you think it was an affair? Perhaps, said Miss Marple, or something more dangerous. A secret not of romance, but of leverage. She stood upright, eyes distant. These letters were kept hidden, and yet Vera must have found them. She likely took them with the brooch. Perhaps not for theft, but as leverage, or protection. Mrs. Tilling looked stunned. You think she's being blackmailed? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. I think, she said slowly, someone is trying to control Vera, just as someone tried to manipulate Edwin. The same typewritten notes, the same London postmark, the same timing. She replaced the items carefully. But if Vera didn't kill her stepmother, Mrs. Tilling asked, why hide the brooch? Because, Miss Marple said softly, she may not know who to trust. And now I fear she's in real danger. That night, the village was rocked by the rumor that Vera Edgecombe had vanished. Mrs. Tilling reported her missing just before supper. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Her handbag and coat were gone. No note was left. Her room smelled faintly of cold lavender soap and candle wax. A single window pane was ajar. The only thing left behind, the typewritten letter she'd received the day before. Miss Marple read it herself. It was short. You know what happened in Chelsea. If you don't come to me, others will find out. Meet me where the lily bloom. Midnight. Miss Marple folded it silently. Where the lily bloom. She already knew where that was, and she would be there first.